The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. Even if you know nothing about military aviation, you've probably heard the name. On October 14, 1943, 60 of them were shot down in a single afternoon over Germany. It's become synonymous with American air power in World War II, immortalized in films, documentaries, and countless books about the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The very name suggests an impregnable aerial castle, bristling with defensive armament, capable of fighting its way through anything the Luftwaffe could throw at it. But here's what most people don't realize. The B-17 was designed to defend the continental United States from a Japanese invasion fleet that would never come. Its defensive armament, famously heavy by the standards of the late 1930s, was considered woefully inadequate by 1943. Its bomb load was smaller than the British bombers it flew alongside. And the entire strategic bombing doctrine it was built to execute, precise daylight attacks on specific industrial targets, would prove murderously difficult to implement, costing the lives of thousands of airmen before the strategy could claim any meaningful success. The B-17 that enters popular imagination is the late war G model, chin turret, 13.50 caliber machine guns, flying in massive formations protected by long-range escort fighters. But this aircraft, and the tactics that made it effective, emerged only after years of catastrophic losses, forced the Army Air Forces to abandon nearly every assumption that had guided the bomber's original design. The Flying Fortress succeeded in spite of its design philosophy, not because of it. This is the story of how an aircraft built to fight one war had to be painfully adapted to fight an entirely different one. To understand the B-17, you have to go back to the bombers that came before it. More importantly, to the men who believed bombing would define modern warfare. In the aftermath of World War I, a small group of American airmen became convinced that strategic bombing, attacking an enemy's industrial capacity and civilian morale, rather than just its armies, would render traditional warfare obsolete. Chief among these visionaries was Brigadier General Billy Mitchell, whose relentless advocacy for air power eventually got him court-martialed in 1925. But Mitchell's disciples would have the last laugh. They ended up running the Army Air Corps. By the early 1930s, these officers had consolidated their power and their doctrine. They believed that heavily armed bombers, flying in formation at high altitude, could fight their way through enemy defences without fighter escort. They believed that precision bombing of key industrial nodes would cripple an enemy's capacity to wage war far more efficiently than ground campaigns. And perhaps most critically, they believed all of this because they had to. The alternative was remaining subservient to the Army's ground forces, which was simply unacceptable if you wanted an independent air force. But there was a problem. They had no bomber capable of demonstrating any of this. In 1934, the Army Air Corps was flying the Martin B-10, which was reasonably modern by the standards of the day. It had a monoplane design, enclosed cockpits, and retractable landing gear. But it was also slow, had limited range, and could only carry a ton of bombs. It was utterly inadequate for the kind of strategic campaign the air power theorists envisioned. What they needed was something revolutionary, and they needed it to defend against a very specific threat. Throughout the 1930s, American war planners were increasingly concerned about Japanese expansion in the Pacific. War Plan Orange, the primary strategic document for a potential conflict with Japan, assumed that any war would begin with Japanese attacks on American possessions in the Pacific, particularly the Philippines and Hawaii. The US Navy would need months to fight its way across the Pacific. These territories would be on their own for an extended period. The solution, according to Air Corps planners, was long-range bombers operating from these island bases. These aircraft would intercept Japanese invasion fleets far from shore, sinking transports and warships before they could land troops. To do this effectively, they needed to fly hundreds of miles over open ocean, find enemy ships in all weather conditions, and survive the inevitable fighter opposition from Japanese carriers. This scenario, defending against naval invasion, shaped every aspect of what would become the B-17. Long range for extended overwater patrols, multiple engines for reliability across the Pacific, heavy defensive armament to fend off carrier-based fighters, sophisticated navigation equipment to find ships in the vast emptiness of the ocean. In May 1934, the Army Air Corps issued a specification for what it called a multi-engine bomber. The requirements seemed straightforward: carry a 2,000-pound bomb load at least 1,020 miles at a speed of 200 miles per hour. But the Air Corps made clear it was interested in something far more ambitious. They wanted an aircraft that could carry the same bomb load for 2,000 miles at over 250 miles per hour, with a service ceiling above 20,000 feet. 3 companies responded to the competition. Martin submitted the B-12, an evolution of their B-10. Douglas offered the DB-1, a capable twin-engine design that would eventually become the B-18 Bolo, and Boeing, the smallest and most financially precarious of the 3, decided to gamble everything on a 4-engine monster that exceeded the Army's official requirements by such a margin that it almost seemed to be answering a different question entirely. Boeing had been thinking about large bombers since the late 1920s, when they had built the experimental XB-15. Though that aircraft wouldn't fly until 1937, the research had given Boeing's engineers valuable experience with 4-engine designs. When the 1934 competition was announced, Boeing's chief designer Claire Echtvet saw an opportunity to build something genuinely revolutionary, but the company's financial situation was so dire that building even a single prototype would consume virtually all of Boeing's available capital. The board of directors met to decide whether to proceed. If they built the prototype and lost the competition, Boeing would likely go bankrupt. But if they won, they would have a monopoly on the most advanced bomber in the world. They decided to roll the dice. The project was designated Model 299, and Boeing poured $275,000 into its development, roughly $6 million in today's money, and more than the company's entire net worth at the time. The design that emerged was unlike anything else flying. 4 Wright Cyclone engines producing 750 horsepower each, all metal construction with a sleek aerodynamic fuselage, 5 defensive gun positions with .30 and .50 caliber machine guns, and perhaps most impressive of all, a bomb load of 4,800 pounds that could be carried over 2,000 miles at 250 miles per hour, twice the range officially required at a speed that exceeded the Army's wildest hopes. When the Model 299 rolled out of Boeing's Seattle factory on July 17, 1935, a reporter from the Seattle Times looked at the aircraft bristling with gun positions and coined a phrase that would stick: the Flying Fortress. Boeing's marketing department, recognizing genius when they saw it, immediately trademarked the name. The Model 299 first flew on July 28, 1935, with Boeing test pilot Les Tower at the controls. The flight lasted 93 minutes and was, by all accounts, remarkably smooth for a first flight. The aircraft handled well, the engines performed flawlessly, and when Tower brought the bomber in for landing, he remarked that it flew like a dream. 10 days later, the Model 299 flew non-stop from Seattle to Wright Field in Ohio, a distance of 2,100 miles, averaging 252 miles per hour and arriving an hour ahead of schedule. When it landed, the assembled Army brass was suitably impressed. This was precisely the kind of technological superiority the Air Corps needed to prove its theories about strategic bombing. The competition itself seemed like a formality. Martin's B-12 and Douglas's DB-1 were competent aircraft, but they were evolutionary designs based on existing concepts. The Model 299 was revolutionary. It could fly faster, farther, and carry more bombs than either competitor. The only question was whether Boeing's finances could survive long enough to win the contract. Then, on October 30th, 1935, disaster struck. During a demonstration flight at Wright Field, the Model 299 took off normally, climbed to about 300 feet, and then stalled. The aircraft nosed over and crashed onto the airfield, erupting into flames. Les Tower, who had piloted that perfect first flight just 3 months earlier, was pulled from the wreckage with severe burns and died 13 days later. Major Ployer Hill, the Army Air Corps pilot who had been evaluating the aircraft, also died from his injuries. The investigation revealed what had happened. The Model 299's flight controls included a new system of gust locks that prevented the control surfaces from being damaged by wind while parked. Unlike previous aircraft, these locks had to be manually released before takeoff. Tower and Hill, both experienced pilots but unfamiliar with this particular system, had attempted to take off with the controls still locked. It was pilot error, pure and simple, but it was pilot error caused by the aircraft's complexity. The crash was catastrophic for Boeing. The Army Air Corps ruled that since the Model 299 had crashed during evaluation, it was disqualified from the competition. The contract went to Douglas for the DB-1, which would enter service as the B-18 Bolo. Boeing had gambled everything on winning this contract and now faced bankruptcy. But the crash had also revealed something important. The Army's evaluation pilots had been so impressed with the Model 299's performance that they lobbied intensively for the aircraft to be reconsidered. A small faction within the Air Corps, led by officers who believed deeply in the strategic bombing mission, argued that the crash had nothing to do with the aircraft's fundamental capabilities. The gust lock incident simply proved that complex aircraft required more rigorous procedures, a problem that could be solved with better pilot training and, importantly, the invention of pre-flight checklists. In January 1936, the Army Air Corps found a loophole. While they couldn't award Boeing the main production contract, they could order a small number of aircraft for testing and evaluation. The order was for 13 examples of what would be designated the Y-1B-17, along with a single static test airframe. Boeing, teetering on the edge of insolvency, accepted immediately. The Y-1B-17 incorporated several changes from the ill-fated Model 299. The engines were upgraded to Wright R1820-39 Cyclones producing 930 horsepower each, giving the aircraft a top speed of 256 miles per hour at 14,000 feet. The defensive armament remained sparse by later standards, just 5.30 caliber machine guns in nose, dorsal, ventral and waist positions, but this was considered heavy for 1936. In the summer of 1940, as the Battle of Britain raged, the British government approached the United States about acquiring B-17s for the Royal Air Force. The British were desperate for heavy bombers and were willing to try anything that might turn the tide. The US agreed to sell 20 B-17Cs, designated Fortress 1 in RAF service. The British took delivery in the spring of 1941 and immediately began evaluating the aircraft. Their conclusions were less than enthusiastic. The Fortress. I could indeed fly higher than most German fighters, but its bomb load was disappointingly small, comparable to the British Wellington, a twin-engine bomber. The defensive armament, though heavy by American standards, left the underside of the aircraft vulnerable. And the Norden bomb sight, though theoretically precise, proved almost useless for the British approach to bombing, which involved careful target identification and verification before dropping bombs. The RAF conducted a handful of high-altitude daylight raids with the Fortress 1 in July and August 1941. The results were disastrous. On July 24th, 3 Fortresses attacked Wilhelmshaven. 2 were forced to turn back with mechanical problems, and the 3rd bombed the target but caused no significant damage. On September 8th, 3 Fortresses attempted to bomb Berlin in daylight. 1 was shot down, and the others missed their targets entirely. The British concluded that high-altitude daylight precision bombing was a fantasy. The Norden bomb site couldn't compensate for wind drift at 30,000 feet, oxygen equipment was unreliable, and the extreme cold caused weapons to jam and crews to suffer frostbite. The RAF withdrew the Fortress 1 from combat operations and reassigned the survivors to Coastal Command for maritime patrol work, where they performed adequately but unspectacularly. The American response to this failure was revealing. They blamed the British. Air Corps officers argued that RAF crews hadn't been properly trained, that the British had modified the aircraft incorrectly, and that the tactics employed had been wrong. The fundamental concept, daylight precision bombing with unescorted heavy bombers, remained sound. The British, who had actually tried it in combat, disagreed, but nobody in Washington was particularly interested in their opinions. In September 1941, Boeing began production of the B-17E, which would finally address some of the aircraft's defensive shortcomings. The redesign was extensive. The fuselage was enlarged, the tail was completely redesigned with a large dorsal fin and a much wider horizontal stabilizer, and most importantly, defensive armament was massively increased. The B-17E featured a total of 10.50 caliber machine guns, 2 in a powered dorsal turret, 2 in a powered ventral ball turret, 2 in the tail position, 2 in waist positions, and single guns in the radio operator's position and the nose. This was more than double the defensive armament of the B-17C, and finally gave the aircraft something approaching the all-around coverage that the Flying Fortress nickname implied. The ball turret in particular was an ingenious if nightmarish innovation. Designed by Sperry Corporation, it was a spherical housing suspended beneath the fuselage containing 2.50 caliber guns and 1 very small man. The ball turret gunner would climb into this sphere through a hatch in the fuselage, curl into a fetal position surrounded by ammunition, gun mechanisms and armor plate, and spend the entire mission rotating his position to track enemy fighters. If the turret's hydraulic system was damaged, the gunner couldn't escape, and if the bomber had to make a belly landing, the ball turret gunner would be crushed. It was not exactly ideal for a combat aircraft, but it did solve the problem of defending the bomber's vulnerable underside. The B-17E also featured improved oxygen systems, better heating, and self-sealing fuel tanks as standard equipment. Maximum takeoff weight increased to 53,000 pounds, and the aircraft could now carry a maximum bomb load of 9,600 pounds, though this was only possible on short-range missions. For typical operations, the bomb load remained around 4,000 to 6,000 pounds. Production of the B-17E began in September 1941 at Boeing's Seattle plant, with additional production lines established at Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach facility and Lockheed's Vega plant in Burbank. This was the first time Boeing had licensed production of the aircraft to other manufacturers, a recognition that the coming war would require numbers that Boeing alone couldn't produce. The story of the B-17 in combat is inseparable from the stories of the men who flew it. These were often very young men, average age 22 or 23, who faced absolutely horrific odds in aircraft that, for much of the war, were inadequately protected from enemy fighters. Consider the mission flown by Lieutenant Robert Morgan and the crew of the Memphis Belle on May 17, 1943. This was their 25th mission, the magic number that meant a crew had completed their tour and could go home. The target was Lorient, a submarine base in occupied France, and the mission was relatively short by 8th Air Force standards, only about 5 hours round trip. The Memphis Belle had survived 24 previous missions, which was itself something of a miracle. By May 1943, the statistical chance of a B-17 crew completing 25 missions was roughly 1 in 4. The aircraft had taken hits on nearly every mission. Holes in the wings from flak, shattered plexiglass in the nose from fighter attacks, severed hydraulic lines, damaged engines. Each time, the ground crews had patched her back together and sent her up again. On this final mission, everything that could go wrong nearly did. Over the target, German flak was intense, punching hundreds of holes through the fuselage and wings. A shell fragment severed the interphone system, leaving the crew unable to communicate except by hand signals. Another fragment punctured the oxygen system, forcing the crew to share portable bottles. On the return flight, 2 Fokker-Wulfsbeer FW-190s made repeated attacks, killing the tail gunner and wounding the waist gunner. A 20mm cannon shell exploded in the radio room, destroying most of the equipment and starting a small fire that the radio operator managed to extinguish by beating it with his jacket. But the Memphis Belle made it back to England, and so did her crew. They became celebrities, touring the United States to promote war bonds, and their story became the basis for a 1944 documentary, and decades later, a Hollywood film. But here's what often gets lost in the legend. The Memphis Belle was extraordinarily lucky. For every crew that made it to 25 missions, 3 others were shot down or died in crashes before they could complete their tour. Then there's the story of the B-17F All-American, which demonstrated just how much punishment these aircraft could absorb. On February 1st, 1943, during a raid on Tunis, the All-American was rammed by a German Messerschmitt Bf-109. The fighter's wing sliced through the RB-17's fuselage just aft of the radio room, nearly severing the bomber in 2. The tail section remained attached by only the lower longerons and the skin on the underside of the fuselage. The pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, somehow kept the aircraft flying. The tail gunner and waist gunners were miraculously unhurt, but they were now in a section of the aircraft that was barely connected to the rest of the bomber and flexing alarmingly with every movement. Bragg couldn't land the aircraft in this condition. The tail would almost certainly break off during touchdown. Instead, he ordered the men in the rear to bail out, then flew the stricken bomber back to base and made a gentle landing, after which the aircraft immediately broke in half. That the All-American flew at all in this condition is testament to Boeing's engineering. That it survived the landing is testament to Bragg's skill. That the story has a happy ending, all crew members survived, was pure luck. The German pilot wasn't so fortunate. He was killed in the collision. But not every story has a happy ending. On October 14th, 1943, Black Thursday, the 305th Bombardment Group dispatched 15, B-17 to Schweinfurt. Only 5 returned. One of the aircraft lost was Runnin' Wild, flown by Lieutenant Eugene McCutcheon. According to surviving crew members from other aircraft in the formation, Runnin' Wild was hit by concentrated fire from at least 4 Bf-109s during the initial fighter attacks shortly after crossing into Germany. A 20mm cannon shell exploded in the cockpit, killing McCutcheon instantly and severely wounding the co-pilot. Another shell hit the No. 3 engine, which caught fire and couldn't be extinguished. With the pilot dead and the co-pilot barely conscious, the bomber fell out of formation. The German fighters, seeing the crippled bomber, moved in for the kill. Accounts vary on exactly what happened next. Combat is chaos, and everyone saw something slightly different, but at least 2 more fighters made repeated attacks on the falling bomber. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant John Egan, was killed by a shell that penetrated the turret. The radio operator, Technical Sergeant William Nash, was killed at his gun position. The tail gunner's position took multiple hits and fell silent. The surviving crew members, the wounded co-pilot, the navigator, the bombardier and the 2 waist gunners, managed to bail out. 3 were captured and spent the rest of the war as POWs. 2 evaded capture and made it back to England months later with the help of the French resistance. The co-pilot died of his wounds 3 days after being captured. But here's what gets lost when we focus on the dramatic survival stories. Most crews that were shot down didn't survive. Most damaged bombers didn't make it home. And most attacks by German fighters weren't interrupted by moments of mercy. The B-17's ability to absorb punishment and bring its crew home was real, but it was never a guarantee, and for every Memphis Belle or Ye Old Pub, there were a dozen aircraft like Runnin' Wild that simply disappeared into the hostile skies over Europe. The arrival of long-range escort fighters in early 1944 fundamentally changed the strategic bombing campaign. The P-51 Mustang, equipped with drop tanks, could escort B-17 formations all the way to Berlin and back, engaging German fighters before they could reach the bombers. Losses dropped precipitously, from the 20 to 30% rates of late 1943 to 5 to 8% by the spring of 1944. With proper fighter cover, the B-17 finally became the effective weapons system it was supposed to be. The massive raids of 1944 and 1945, sometimes involving over 1,000 bombers attacking a single target, demonstrated what strategic bombing could achieve when the bombers weren't being slaughtered by enemy fighters. German industrial production was systematically dismantled, oil refineries were destroyed, and transportation networks were pulverized. But there was a bitter irony to this success. The B-17 succeeded only after abandoning the assumptions that had guided its design. It was built to operate without fighter escort, yet only succeeded with constant protection. It was designed with heavy defensive armament to fight off enemy fighters, yet by 1945 those guns fired at empty skies. Allied air superiority was so complete that Luftwaffe interceptions became rare. Production of the B-17 peaked in 1944, with Boeing, Douglas and Lockheed Vega producing over 6,000 aircraft that year. But even as production reached its zenith, the aircraft's replacement was already being planned. The B-29 Superfortress, with its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled gun turrets, and vastly superior range and bomb load, represented the next generation of strategic bomber. By late 1944, B-29s were conducting raids against Japan that the B-17 could never have attempted. The last combat mission by B-17s in Europe was flown on April 25, 1945, against the Škoda works at Pilsen, Czechoslovakia. By this point, the Luftwaffe was essentially non-existent. Flak defences were crumbling, and the war was clearly entering its final days. The bombers met minimal resistance and returned safely. After VE Day on May 8, 1945, the 8th Air Force began the process of demobilization. Thousands of B-17S were flown back to the United States, where most were immediately scrapped or placed in storage. The aircraft that had cost $238,000 each to build, over $4 million in today's money, were sold for scrap aluminum at a few cents per pound. By the end of 1945, the vast majority of the 12,731 B-17S built had been reduced to scrap metal. Some B-17S soldiered on in secondary roles. The Navy acquired several dozen for air-sea rescue work, designating them PB-1. These aircraft, painted in high-visibility yellow and orange, carried lifeboats that could be dropped to downed air crews in the ocean. The Coast Guard used a handful for maritime patrol. Several air forces around the world acquired surplus B-17S for various purposes. The Israeli Air Force even used modified B-17S as bombers during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. But these were marginal roles for an aircraft that had been built to reshape modern warfare. By 1950, almost every B-17 still in military service had been retired or relegated to non-combat duties. The strategic bombing mission that had justified the aircraft's existence now belonged to the B-29 and soon to the B-36 and early jet bombers. Only about 50 B-17s survive today out of nearly 13,000 built. Fewer than a dozen still fly. The Memphis Belle sits pristine in a climate-controlled museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, looking exactly as it did in 1943. But if you look closely, you can still see the patches where flak and fighter attacks punch through the aluminum skin. The most famous survivor is the Belle herself, on permanent display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force, following an extensive restoration completed in 2018. The National Museum of the mighty 8th Air Force in Georgia houses several B-17 artifacts, including a restored forward fuselage section that visitors can climb through. The experience is illuminating and claustrophobic. The interior of a B-17 is cramped, cold, and filled with sharp metal edges and exposed mechanisms. It's hard to imagine spending 10 hours at 25,000 feet in this environment, wearing bulky oxygen masks and heated flight suits, while people are actively trying to kill you. The handful of airworthy B-17S are maintained by organisations like the Commemorative Air Force and the Collings Foundation. These aircraft tour the United States and Europe, offering rides to the public and serving as flying museums of the strategic bombing campaign. There's a tendency, when discussing the B-17, to either romanticise it as the aircraft that won World War II, or to dismiss it as an overrated design that succeeded only through numerical superiority. Both views miss the essential truth. The B-17 was a capable aircraft built on fundamentally flawed assumptions about the nature of strategic bombing. It was designed to operate independently, but required extensive support. It was designed to defend itself, but needed fighter escort to survive. It was designed for precision bombing, but was often used for area attacks. And it was designed to make strategic bombing cheap and decisive, but the campaign it flew cost tens of thousands of American lives and required years of sustained effort before achieving meaningful results. Yet for all its limitations, the B-17 accomplished its mission. Not the mission its designers envisioned, defending American shores from Japanese invasion fleets. But the mission history actually required destroying Nazi Germany's industrial capacity and drawing the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition that Germany couldn't win. The strategic bombing campaign didn't end the war by itself, but it played a crucial role in degrading German war production and forcing the diversion of enormous resources to air defence. The B-17's real legacy isn't the aircraft itself, but what it represented: the first sustained attempt to execute strategic bombing as a war-winning strategy. The lessons learned about the necessity of fighter escort, the limitations of precision bombing, the resilience of industrial economies would shape air warfare for decades to come. The aircraft succeeded eventually, not in the mission its designers envisioned, defending American shores from Japanese invasion fleets, but in the mission history demanded. It didn't prove that unescorted bombers could fight their way through, and it didn't make strategic bombing cheap or easy. What it did prove was that with enough resources, enough time, and enough willingness to abandon failed assumptions, even a flawed strategy could be forced to work. Whether that constitutes success or simply brutal perseverance is a question the 26,000 8th Air Force airmen who never came home didn't get to answer.